Hey everyone, welcome back to the Power Baseball League. Last week we talked about marketing lists and quick campaigns and some of the cool features that you can enable using the out of the box sales app. And today we kind of want to dive into some more out of the box features that are kind of core to Dynamics. We've talked about a lot of different Power Platform things in our time here, but we wanted to take the next few sessions to talk about some kind of core Dynamics functionality. And we're going to kick that off today talking about business rules. So business rules are a great way to allow kind of your citizen developers, your customizers to build JavaScript-like functionality in a point and click format. So it's a tool that I really love, and they're really fun to build for things like making a field required, defaulting field values and things like that, or showing error messages, lots of cool things. So I'm going to pass it over to Malcolm, who's going to build one for our Power Baseball League environment.
Absolutely. And it's funny because we were trying to think of an example that we could use, and usually there's lots of little things, and I was kind of banging my head against the desk like I don't really know for our fake example what to do, so maybe it's easier in real life. I don't know. But what I'll do is I'm going to pull up our screen here, which you should see in just a second. And so what we landed on in terms of a scenario that was pretty realistic in terms of the baseball registrations and collecting registration information was that typically when you're registering for youth sports, depending on the tier you're registering or the level or division you're registering for, there may be a different cost. And so that's not always true, but for the purposes of this example, it's a perfect scenario to use for business rules, because what we want to do is set up something that essentially makes sure that when somebody registers and pays a certain amount of money, that the division that they're being placed in automatically is set rather to the correct one. So there's a good, I guess the benefit here is that it helps with that whole data integrity thing, which I think we talked about in a number of videos ago, where it's taking the human error out, right? It's very easy for somebody to be entering registrations on the fly and make a mistake by saying, oh yeah, they're in the intermediate division, not the junior division. And that could have big implications for, in our example here, for a registration, all of a sudden a child's put on the wrong team or in the wrong league and they're too young or too old for that division, and that causes a whole bunch of challenges with numbers and stuff like that. So that's one simple example. You could also think of real world examples where, especially if you're talking about like finances and stuff like that, where the data integrity is really, really critical. It's got to be right. Otherwise, it's going to have lots of downstream negative impact, which you don't want. So what we've got here is just our table of registrations set up. So we're going to go into the Maker portal first. And what I've done is I've gone into our solution and into our Power Baseball League solution that we're working out of. And I've gone into our registration entity or table. And on the list of options here, you'll see we've got business rules. Right now, we don't have any. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. I'm going to click Add New Business Rule. And that's going to launch the Business Rule Designer. And so this designer looks very much like that whole business process flow structure. So very similar, if not exactly the same, really, in terms of the structure of the environment that you're working in, which is helpful for continuity. And so the first thing I want to do is just let's give it a name. So we'll call this Registration Division Business Rule. We'll just call it that for starters. And then we can put a quick description in. I'm going to skip that, but please don't in real life. Please put a description, because if you win the lottery and you leave, these descriptions can really be helpful for people who are coming in, or if you're working amongst multiple people, it gives you an area to kind of flesh out what it is. And so I'm going to skip it just for the purposes of this video, but I promise I'm going to go back and fill it in after we're done. So we've got in our little canvas, if you will, we've got the start of our rule is already in here, and it's the first condition, which is the first thing that it's kind of looking at. And so the one that we want to do right out of the gate is we're already on the right source, so we have the entity already pre-selected, and we want the amount paid when that equals a specific value. So I'm going to say $225. Now, some of you may be watching and be like, well, what if the rate changes down the road and all that? Let's pretend that's never going to happen. For the purposes of this example, this is always going to be the case. It's always going to be $225. I'm going to go ahead and apply that, but before I do, I'm going to give the display name, say check amount paid. I'll go ahead and apply that. And when I click apply, it's now embedded those details onto that first sort of check condition, if you will. So it's going to look for that. And I now want to flip over to the Components tab. And I'm going to go ahead and say set value. You'll notice you've got a bunch of options. You can make a recommendation to somebody. You could lock a field or unlock a field. You can set a default value or visibility or set something required or not required. So lots of flexibility in here. For the purposes of this, we're just going to say set the value. So we know that 225 equals the division of junior. So I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to pick the division field and I'm going to set the value to junior. I'm going to update the name again just so that it's clear on the actual map itself. I'm going to call this set division to junior. Let's copy that. And so I'm going to apply. And now we want to go down and say, well, what happens when that isn't the case, right? So our first condition, sorry for hopping around, our first condition said when when amount paid equals 225. Well, what if it's not 225? We got to add another condition underneath it. So we'll say now we're going to check. So we'll do this again, check amount paid to. And I'm going to go ahead and say when this value equals our next tier in terms of registration is 250. So I'll go ahead and apply that. And if that's the case, now we want to set the field value. And we're going to set the same field. So we're going to go back to division, but this time we're going to say it's intermediate. And again, I'm going to go ahead and put that in here. I just copied that last time, intermediate, just to speed it up a little bit. Apply. Now again, what happens in that third tier? We know that there's one more option that somebody can pay, which would be $300. So I'm going to go ahead and put another condition in here. And we're going to set amount paid 300. I'll go ahead and rename that. Wrong thing. Check amount paid 3. Apply that. And then again, I want to not set visibility, set the field value. And again, I want division to senior. I'll just update this and apply. And so that will bring our business rule essentially to a close. Now you can get a little more complex. You can add in things like, well, what happens if there's a value outside of all three of those? You could set another condition that checks for other values or does other things, or says if it's a 0, maybe give an error or make a recommendation or something like that. For the purposes of this, we know that that data is always going to be one of those three amounts. So we're going to go ahead and just publish this. So I'm going to save it and it'll do its little thing. And then I'm going to go ahead and you'll see the options up top change. And I'm going to go ahead and activate it.
And before we leave this screen, can we talk quickly about the scope? Because I think generally, I think a lot of you might be familiar with scope from workflows or Power Automate, but you have the ability within your business, business rule, to configure if you want it to happen at a certain form. So maybe you have a marketing form that requires certain logic that your salespeople wouldn't need to follow. You could set that up, or you can make it for all forms, but that still means you have to be on looking at a form and interacting with the data for that rule to be applied. But then you also have what we had set here by default was entity, meaning that this logic will be applied anytime that a record is modified, whether that is through a form or through being created via Power Automate or something else. That logic would still be applied to that record. So just something to keep in mind. And if you're running into issues when you're building this, that would be the first thing I would test and review and make sure is right.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I totally skipped over that. So good catch. That explains that part. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on. I'm going to activate. And pardon me, it's going to give us a second window to click activate again. And so I'm going to leave this open because we may want to edit it if we find it's not working properly, but it's now turned on. And so the neat thing about these is once they're on, they're on. So if I refresh in here And I'm going to open up one of these registration records. And I'm just going to go ahead and change the amount. So you'll see the division right underneath says junior. I'm going to go ahead and change this to 250. And if I click out of that, it automatically turns that to intermediate. If I change this to 300, it knows that that's a senior registration. It's going to flip that to senior. So again, use case wise, maybe not the most perfect one in terms of a realistic scenario. It does make sense if the money's coming in automatically and you know that those are the values. Obviously, again, I talked about human error earlier. If somebody's keying in data, it's entirely possible for this to go 301, and what's going to happen, the business rule is not going to recognize that, so it's going to leave the division as whatever it was because it doesn't have a condition in there to deal with that value. So there are some gotchas you got to think about as you're planning this out, but in this scenario, we've got this structured that way, so I'll go ahead and save that. And so that's just a high-level overview of what a business rule is and how it works. And as you can imagine, if you're looking at this, you can get pretty complex. There's a lot of stuff you can do. We do actually have another business rule in here that I wanted to show you. Sorry, and I'll go in and you'll see just how much more complex it is. It's this one that's showing and hiding data on the contact record based on information. And I'm not going to go into detail on what this is other than to show you all of the different things that are happening. You can see that it can be quite lengthy. There can be a lot of steps that are going on in here. So there's a lot of valuable functionality in these business rules that you can leverage. And the beautiful thing that Kylie touched on earlier is it takes the need away from having to get a developer in there and write some code in JavaScript that you maybe can't edit after the fact. If I don't know code, so if something ever had to change, I'd try my hand at it and maybe copy and paste something, but I'd more likely than not screw things up. So I'm loving the ability to mess around with a business rule because if I mess it up, I can go back and just reconfigure and figure out where I went wrong and not have to read through layers of code and try and figure out what the heck it's saying.
Yeah, and I think this rule that you pulled up now is a great example of another best practice, which is to always make sure you have the positive side of the equation as well as the negative side, right? So especially when we're talking about things like locking and unlocking fields, setting visibility and setting things required, you want to make sure that if this happens, I'm setting it required, for example, but then if that's not happening or if the value is something else, I remember to set it to not required, right? Because you do want to think about the whole time someone is interacting with the form, right? They might set a field and then realize that they did something wrong and go back and change it, and you need to make sure that the form is always up to date. So I think that's another good reminder to check your logic and verify what's there.
Yeah, and you'll see when this one was put together, we tried to structure it so that the same clauses, if you will, right, or the same actions, or what they're called, the same actions are aligned so that it makes it a little easier. You can't always do that. The example that we used to start this video, or in the actual video, it was layered, so there's a new condition which moves everything over, so you end up like a ladder approach. So it makes it a little harder, but it's just about attention to detail and paying attention to what you're doing. Keep track of your steps as you go, and you'll be just fine. So that's it. Hopefully that gives you kind of an overview. And if you're brand new to the platform or you've never played around with business rules, I mean, we just whipped that together in a few minutes. It's pretty straightforward. Grab a sandbox or a trial environment, pop in, and give one a try. Just a simple show hide or make a required or unrequired field, something like that, just to get familiar with it, and then you'll be off to the races in no time.
Yeah, and I think I really like the showing error messages or showing recommendations. These are great ways to add things that make a big difference to your users and can really help guide them into the right functionality and things like that. And those are great features that I really like. So I'd encourage you to check those out. My last pro tip I would throw in there for you guys too is to be careful if you also have developers in your system, right? If you have some things on JavaScript and some things on business rules, it's easy for there to potentially be complications with when one is running and when the other one is running and things like that. I believe all of your business rules will fire first and then your JavaScripts in some kind of set order, but it's very easy for that to get confused or us to not expect that functionality. So just quick reminder to be careful when you're doing that and, make sure you're communicating with your developers and know what's going on in your system.
Yeah.
So That's all we have for you today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.